Welcome back. My name is Jack Burgess. As you probably know, I model Yosemite Valley Railroad. I want to give you a couple of notes about how I picked that. I started back in 1967 when I decided to model a real railroad and not freelance. And so I went to the library and they had 3 books, as I recall. This was one of them. And this book was on the Yosemite Valley Railroad. And I knew I wanted to scratch build everything. I needed a lot of photos, and this book had a lot of photos. So I decided to model it. My first layout was a test layout. It went around 3 sides of the garage. It was never intended to be a final layout. I needed to learn how to lay track, how to build scenery, build bench work, and so forth. And a few years later, I started on this layout. I finally finished it in 2011 after 31 years of building it. So it is done. And people say, no layout is done. You can always add more details. No. Once I said it was done, I have not done anything to the layout. No changes. So what I want to do this time is, I've had a lot of visitors come over. Not everybody that has read my articles and so forth has had a chance to see it. So I'll take you inside and show you the layout just as you would see it if you were here. Okay, so this is the first thing you see when you come into the layout. This is the SP interchange between the YV and SP. This tracks back here are the SP tracks. Los Angeles is several hundred miles that direction. The station still exists in Merced. That only had room for part of it there. This building, first time I went down there, the building was still there. Didn't get around to measuring it, and eventually decided to build it. This building is still there. These are gone now. So this is YV tracks coming in here. They take Pullmans off of that train, add them to the YV train in each morning and so forth. This is YV trackage coming into an ice plant. And originally my thought was to have an operator that would take cars from here or take cars off of the SP, take them up to the main yard. And I finally decided that would be a very boring job. Back and forth, back and forth. And so I've never followed that idea. Nothing has ever operated on this section, but it does kind of give you an idea of the entire YV, starting here, going all the way up to El Portal. I should mention that all the track is hand-laid, including all the turnouts. Every single building on the layout, and there's over 100, has been scratch built. I don't have any kits. I've never even put together a kit for a building. And also, and very important, the track arrangements very closely follow the prototype. So in this yard, for example, the track over there is coming in from the SP, just like it did on the YV, the real one, and then comes down here, spreads out, and continues around. I have original drawings of this yard, and here's what the yard looked like. And you can see that in the drawing, it does the same thing. It comes through a curve, and the only difference was there was a Y out here. That Y was to turn the passenger cars, especially the observation, because that always has to be in a certain orientation. I decided when I was designing my layout to not run passenger cars. A couple of reasons. One is that operator would take the train, it would be all built up, and he would take it to the other end of the layout, and he was done. There was no switching, nothing else. Also, if I were to run passenger trains, curves would need to be a little wider, grades not as steep, and some other compromises. So there was no need for a Y here. On the prototype, this track stopped right here, did not connect, but that's a minor thing. And what I've seemed to have read many times is somebody will be freelancing, they'll lay out a yard, and pretty soon after they've used it, they find mistakes or things that don't work out, and they tear it out and start over. If you're modeling a real railroad, they've already thought of the tracks they need. They don't lay it and then a year later decide to change it. So even if you're freelancing, you could go to Google Maps and look at yards and the railroads that exist today and look at their yards and see if they would work for you. One difference, though, is that today, with all the containers and so forth, the operations are much different than they were back in the steam era. There is a major yard here in Newark. When I got back into model railroading back in the late 60s, I would go down there and photograph real freight cars and build a model of them. And now you go down there and there's no cars there because they don't run box cars anymore, for example. So era is important. But this has really worked for me. And it's fun to see people building a train and doing the same thing guys would have done back in 1939, the year I model. Okay, this is the station here at Merced. This is the second model I built of that station. First one I built decades ago, and I didn't have that many photos. I didn't have any dimensions, but I had a photo and there's some people in it, some men, and so I assumed they were 6 feet tall and designed the entire building based on that fact. I had not yet built this building, and I learned that there was a person that had a drawing of this building. It was a tracing done by a person that was a draftsman for the Yosemite Valley Railroad. And I eventually got a copy of it, and I was ready now to build this. So I printed the drawing that showed this end of the building and brought this up to it, and it was obvious that this was too big. And so I would then have to build this too big, and I will not intentionally build something wrong. So I started all over and built a new station that was correct and the freight house. The first one, the windows were big enough that you could look inside and see people and so forth. This one, the windows were the right size, and that wasn't possible. So what I did is I put a couple periscopes into the building. You push a button here, that lights it up, and you can actually see inside the building just as if you were there. One side is the dispatcher's office, which was over here. The other periscope goes into this room, which was the ticket office. And in the dispatcher's office, there is an August 1939 calendar. I was given a calendar by my wife's father several decades ago, and so I took a photo of it, reduced it to HO, and put it in the building. So here we're at the other end of the yard. All these structures were scratch built, including this one. And I didn't have any measurements. So what I did is I had a photo looking straight into this portion. What do you know? You know the track gauge. So on the photo, I measured the track gauge, and then I measured between these two posts, and it came out 16 feet. Sounds logical to me. So with that, let me build all of this. I knew how long it was and so forth. What I also had was a list of all of the machinery and tools that were in here, because the scrapper, when he was trying to make money and sell as much as he could, was trying to sell all these tools. Now, a friend of mine that I've talked about before, who was a brakeman on the YV for several months, told me that he thought all those tools came around the horn before there were even railroads. They were so old. He was exaggerating, but he was giving you an idea of how old those tools were. Originally, the roof was removable, and I had it not even on the layout so people could see inside. But it really messed up photos, and if it's leaning there, I couldn't take a real good photo of everything. So I finally glued it in place. But before I did that, I took this photo, and you can see over here all of the tools. Over here on the left side was the blacksmith and so forth. I also have a water cooler back there, a bottle of water like I would think they would have in those days, because my friend said that was the coldest water on all of Merced. He liked the water. So over on the side is a small building, and it's right here. And I never did figure out what it was. I assume it was a break room, or at least a place where you could put your lunch pail and so forth. So I modeled it. When I took the top off and took a photo of this whole thing, you can see inside I put a bench and a table. And then I thought, okay, so somebody's eating their lunch. So here on the table, you can see someone's sandwich with a bite out of it. And next to it is a Coke bottle. I made the Coke bottle on my lathe, and we're talking now, a bottle is about that tall. And so I had 10 power magnifiers on, using a file to get the contours. I finally had what I thought was going to be a good-looking Coke bottle, cut it off, and it drops into the chips and disappeared. It took me a long time to find it, but it's in there too. So this is the crossing that the YV had with the Santa Fe. And there's a tower here, just like they had. What I did, which is a little more unusual, is I have derails, which they had, so that if you went by this signal, this is at stop, if you did not stop, you would derail your train rather than possibly hit a train that was on the tracks here. Same thing for the other direction. So what's also different is these all work. So what this operator would do if a YV train came up, he would set the derails against the Santa Fe and set the signals against the Santa Fe. And then he would first close that derail and then close this derail and then drop the signal, and the train came through. Now, I suspect that in the morning when the passenger train came in, they're coming in the same time every single day. So these would be set up in advance. But in the afternoon, locals went out, and it could be 4 o'clock, it could be 4:30, whatever. When they were done and they got their orders, they would leave. And so this guy had to be ready to take care of that. But also, if you think about it, he's in a tower, and 4 trains a day go past this tower. That's a lot of sitting. A lot of reading. Beyond the tower are 3 bridges. The first one is Bear Creek, then there's Black Rascal Creek, and then Farron's Creek. So this is Bear Creek. It was pretty close to the tower, probably not this close, but I included a little Tom Sawyer figure fishing, and on the other side are some ducks getting ready to go under the bridge. Now, the ducks are not glued to the water, nor is Tom Sawyer. So when I need to really clean the water, I can take them out, clean it, and then put them back. Next is Black Rascal Creek. You can see cattle coming down to get water. There are cow pies. I also put a fence in here, barbed wire fence. And I did an article on all 3 of these creeks from Model Railroader back in the 80s. And in those days, no cell phones and no email. So you would have to wait 2 months to see if someone wrote a letter to the editor, because they might write it right away, and then it has to go in the next issue and so forth. And so when that final issue came out, yes, there is a letter about my bridges and fences and so forth. Well, the guy told me that the barbed wire was on the wrong side of the post. I never knew that. I had climbed through a lot of barbed wire fences as a kid, but I never paid attention. The wire has to be on the side with the animals, because otherwise they can just lean and tear the whole fence down. So I learned a lesson. The next fence I built is correct. So this is Farron's Creek. Not much happening here except a really big bird taking off. Nowadays, the abutments for this bridge are still there. There's a parking lot over on the side, and it's a start of a hiking trail. So they've turned the railroad bridge into a pedestrian bridge, so people can visit this area. This is a sighting into Yosemite Portland Cement. That was a huge plant. Here's a photo of it, and I did not even try to model it. It would have been way back in there. In the photo is the YV tracks coming into a dump where they would dump the limestone. But this is limestone that was loaded online at a place we'll see a little bit later. brought down here and turned into Yosemite Portland cement. You might notice the telephone poles that I have around the layout. I don't remember who the manufacturer was, but they are extremely accurate. Decades ago, I had a person come over that had some job which involved the telephone poles, and he looked very closely at the insulators and identified the manufacturer of that insulator. So they are accurate. But also what I've done is I have not put telephone poles everywhere. If an area you've got a lot of stuff going on, I don't need another telephone pole. But if it's kind of open like this area, then a telephone pole adds a little more interest. Next up is Bridge 13A. That means this is the first bridge, A, in the 13th mile. I don't know how any other railroads did that, but it was an obvious way to keep track of bridges, and so everybody knew which bridge it was and so forth. There were 2 of these bridges, each 150 feet long. My model is 125 feet long, and that was connected to a wooden trestle that was about 1,000 feet long. Next up is Merced Falls. This was a company town, which meant that Yosemite Lumber Company owned everything in the entire town except the station, the water tank, and a couple of little service buildings. This is the hotel. This is the dining hall. Or I think that employees would wear a badge like this, and that got them into the dining hall. That way the people knew that you were an employee because you had the pin. The hotel for a long time was a real problem for me because I think of hotels as being in an area that people want to visit, San Francisco, national parks, and so forth. In our town, one time now, 2 or 3 decades ago, we had a company that built computers that did not run Windows. And so a hotel was built right across the street from the company, and people would come in, fly in, and stay in that hotel for a week while they learned how to use those computers. So having a hotel here didn't make any sense. What I finally realized is that the employees that were making a good wage, if they were single, they didn't know how to cook, they didn't have any cooking gear, they didn't know how to wash their clothes, so they stayed in the hotel, and all those services were done for them. So that's why they have a hotel here. The building over here is one of the buildings where they cut lumber. The lumber company cut everything that they found. They clear cut. And people say, oh my God, they destroyed it. If you go up there now, you cannot find where they were harvesting lumber. Everything has grown back. But the really good grades like Doug fir were cut up and shipped out as planks like what's going on right here. The cheap stuff was made into box shooks. And here's box shooks here. This building is full of box shooks. What box shooks were, they didn't have cardboard in those days. So if you had a product that today might be shipped in a box, cardboard box, those days it was shipped in a wood box. What you would do is place an order and say, I want a box that's so wide, so big, so high, so forth. It needs to carry so much weight. If you want the name, your name of the company on it, they would do that. They would cut all the pieces of the box and then tie a rope around them, and that was called a box shook. When you got a box shook, then you took the rope off and nailed the box together. And so they did a really big business in box shooks because that was what all the really cheap lumber that was not good for anything else was used for. The water tank and the water spout does work and swings out the other direction. So now we need to get from the first level up to the second level. And the way I did that is first you go into Tunnel 1, and there were 4 tunnels along this section that were built to relocate the railroad because they were building a dam to dam up the Merced River. So this is Tunnel 1. It's accurate. The one thing I wish I could have figured out is how to get the date up in that blank. Nowadays, I would 3D print the portal. Here they were cast of plaster. So you go into tunnel 1, and then we do a 180-degree helix. The track climbs up and goes over itself and exits out of tunnel 4. Tracks have now come out of tunnel 4 and start across the Clear Reservoir. Now this is actually a bridge that was further up the line. This is part of it. It says Barrett Bridge, but that is no longer correct because here's Barrett Bridge. This was completely scratch built, took me 6 months to build, used all of the 1x2 styrene in the entire Bay Area, not a hobby shop had anymore. And fortunately, I knew the owner of Evergreen Models, called him and said, I need 12 more packs of 1x2. The check's in the mail if you'll mail it to me, which he did. What happened, and this was actually a contest entry, and so what happened is we had an open house. A person was in the room on the other side of those doors talking about my cat and so forth, and was in there for about an hour. And he finally came in and opened the door, walks in, sees the entire layout, misses a step down there, and falls and thinks if he puts his hand out, the bridge will break his fall. Instead, his hand broke the bridge. So I built this bridge. There's no way I was going to take another 6 months to build that bridge. This one probably took a couple of weeks. And you'll notice there is now yellow ADA pad there. That stuff is expensive. I bought a sheet like this, but I used it in 2 or 3 places. But now I tell people, watch your foot, and I think that helps. We haven't had another fall since then. So this track now continues to get to the second deck, and it's behind this backdrop. So it's right about here and just keeps climbing on a constant 2% grade. I had concerns initially that what if an engine stopped? Well, with sound on all your engines, you can hear it. And it takes a couple minutes to go from here to the second deck. But what I didn't want to do was put that track out here. That would have made it very difficult to see the backside of the yard. And more important to me, it would be a real distraction. I want people that are operating my layout to really feel like they're in 1939. And so when you're building your train here, I didn't want any other distractions, nothing else going on. You just are doing your job and trying to leave on time. So that climbing track is on the other side of the view block and comes out here. So this is the Bagby Bridge, and it consisted of a wood trestle, one of these short bridges here, one here, so forth. And I wanted to include all those elements, but that meant that I had to make this bridge shorter than the prototype. There should be 4 panels in this bridge instead of 2. And then I had to lower the height of the bridge to keep the proportions correct. So one thing I hadn't thought about but actually worked finally is when I got it installed, I put my caboose on, I ran a train across, and the smokestack on the caboose barely cleared the top of the bridge, so I was at least okay. I've given thought to taking this out, maybe deleting these, and building one bridge that expands all the way. It's going to be a lot of work. I'm not sure I want to do that, but it's not even on my to-do list, but something I've thought about. Bagby Hotel. I built a copy of what I thought it looked like a long time ago, and that building was terrible. Here's a picture of it. I can't even say that it was the best I could do at the time, but it had to go. And so I had more information when I was going to build this. The first problem with the original building was that it was all in level ground. Here's a photo of the actual building taken from upstream looking down the river, and you can see the hotel on the right-hand side. So I had to cut out part of the bench work in order to be able to make that all fit and do it correctly. The windows are 3D printed, the doors are 3D printed, the chairs are 3D printed. Those were easy because there's plans online. These are called Adirondack chairs, and there's lots of plans for making your own chairs. So I got the plan, drew it up, had the chairs printed, and I thought, God, they look a little small. And I took a figure and tried to make it sit. They were kids' chairs. So I had to start all over and make the chairs correctly. I couldn't figure out what was going on down here. And I finally decided that because of this pipe here, this was the kitchen. And that meant there had to be stairs under the building up into the room where the dining table would be. You would not want to be taking food out and out through here if it's raining. So I built stairs there under the building. I feel 95% certain that I'm correct, but we will never know because this building is long gone. I also added interior detailing, and upstairs was all bedrooms, and I think there were some bedrooms downstairs. The hotel was built in 1900, and that's when stagecoaches were traveling this road, which was, of course, dirt in those days. Stagecoaches cannot run at night. I never realized that until I started thinking about why they would have a hotel here. So stagecoaches would come in, stop, and people would spend the night in this hotel. The next day they would go on. And if they turned on the next town, that would get you to Yosemite National Park. One more thing, another photo, I could see this, and I finally realized it had to be an outhouse. But my knowledge of outhouses is limited to a traditional outhouse where you dig a hole, you have a short building over it. When the hole gets full, you move the building, dig into the hole. So this being up off the ground really bothered me. I couldn't imagine how that would work. But I did some research, and researches on outhouses, and I discovered that there was another type of an outhouse, which this was, where there were buckets that you would sit on a wood bench, and there was a bucket under there and a can of ashes from the fireplace. Cover what you had just done, and that eliminated the smell. So that's what was going on here. This photo was taken during one of the rail fairs trips. The train stopped here in Bagby to get water. Everybody got off, stretched their legs, and guys came down here because this was a store and they could buy Coca-Cola or whatever. And one of them took a photo from right up here looking this direction, and I was intrigued with the details right here. I could tell from the photo that one of the signs was a highway sign because it's in the shape of a shovel, which honors the gold miners that came to California. And we still use that shape for all of our signs for state highways. And this is and was Highway 49. So that is a Highway 49 sign. The gas pump was easy. The Flying A sign was easy. And there's a Coca-Cola sign over here. So I got it all done. And what I didn't realize is I found a Flying A sign online and used it and took a picture of this, had a clinic, and shared that photo. And a friend of mine in the very back said, "Jack, that's not the correct Flying A sign." He was correct. I had a Flying A sign, so this is the second one that I did and matches the photo. So this is the Bagby Station. The Bagby sign is on the wall over there, so that is this sign right here. A couple of decades ago, I was talking to one of the sons of Cliff Grant that owned Grant Line, and he just casually mentioned to me that their biggest seller are windows. And I said, well, if I gave you the measurements, would you do the windows that were on this station and on the Merced Falls station? And he said yes. So I didn't hear anything from him for probably 6 months or more. And then one day I got a little package in the mail, and here were 24 of each of the windows that they'd cut for me. So the windows here are Grant Line windows. That made this a lot easier building to build. There is also an interior, and this is where the station agent lived. But the station agent here was single, and so he lived in a hotel, so someone else would cook his meals and wash his clothes. And the track superintendent for this section of track, he and his family got to live here. Maybe 10, 15 years ago, I got a call from a woman who wanted to come over and see my layout. She was the daughter of that track worker, and they lived up here. And so when they came over, they were looking at the whole railroad and so forth. And it was the daughter and one son. The son was telling me that they had a radio. I had thought about putting a little radio in here. I actually bought one. It was only about this tall. But we're in the bottom of this 2,000-foot deep V-shaped canyon, and I didn't think they would get radio reception. But he said they had a radio and used it, so I had to believe him. Well, a couple of years later, I got this photo, and if you look closely, you can see the antenna wires from the radio. One thing I've done on all my vehicles is include 1939 license plates, and you can see one here on this car. This shot swings from Bagby to Emery. And one thing I've done, which has worked out really well, is I don't put more than one switching location per wall. So there are meets at Bagby, and one of the trains will drop off a boxcar there. And then the next place that stuff is going on is over here. So you don't have the problem of your caboose is in this town and your engine is in the next town. Earlier I talked about the Portland Cement Company spur down on the lower level. This is where that material is coming from. There was a quarry up there, a crusher here, and an incline railroad to get the stuff down to be stored here and then dropped into these cars. These cars are Westerfield kits, and several decades ago, Westerfield had a kit for exactly the same car, but it was longer. And I got in touch with him and I said, I can provide plans and measurements because there were some of these cars that were also purchased by the Sierra Railroad, and they were on display on the highway going up to the Sierra Railroad. And so I said I could go out and measure the cars and take detailed photos, and he came out with this kit. And he said it was the most funny he'd ever had because he had all of the information. Because I would say, okay, if I were to be scratch building this, I would need to take a picture of that little thing right there, and I would take a picture of it and so forth. So the YV had 51 of these cars, and when Westerfield came out with the kits, I bought 51 kits so that I could model every single car the YV had. I had to save up a lot of money to be able to do that, because I think it was about $500. Well, I can only use 10 of them on the layout, 5 up here and 5 down there, and so I have 40 more kits that are sitting around unbuilt. I don't think I'll ever build them. So there were 2 of these buildings. They were used for providing a place for the workers to sleep and so forth and get their meals. The second one I could have built, it was identical, but it would have pushed the scene a little bit further that way. So I felt one was good enough. We have a chat list of people interested in the YV, and it turns out one of those members was a owner, part owner, along with a bunch of other people, of this whole entire quarter, 640 acres. So we set up a YV weekend. The river is right here. There was a little cableway where there was a little trolley and you kind of push yourself or pull yourself across. One of our members had some rafts, and so we had probably about 15 YV fans spend a weekend here. And we got across the river, slept inside here, barbecued dinner, climbed the incline, which was about 2,000 feet long, and went out to the quarry, and then came back on what had been a road for trucks and so forth. but it got narrow because no one had maintained it. So it was actually a trail that was about this wide. Coming down it, I was leading, and I noticed a lot of poison oak, and I said, everybody knows what poison oak looks like, right? No, no, no. So the rest of the way I would say, poison oak, left knee, right ankle, and it worked because no one got poison oak on that trip. But it was an interesting way to really experience this area. This is Jenkins Hill. What happened is generally the Merced River is flowing east and west, but in this area it turns and it's going north and south. So that creates a shadow, early afternoon shadow up on the hill, and causes all this vegetation to grow. So this is the bridge at Fox Creek. My bridge is half as long as the prototype, but what was interesting to me is the way that the concrete foundations were put in. Originally, these bridges didn't have concrete foundations. They were built right on the ground, and that caused them to start rotting fairly quickly. And by the early 20s, a lot of the bridges had to be fixed and bottom portions cut off and so forth. So this one, for example, this down here was okay, but all the stuff down here on this bent was bad and had to be cut off. So they stepped these, which I found very interesting. What they also did at a lot of places up and down the canyon was these retaining walls. And I didn't have any idea how to build them, but there was a police officer that would come over if he knew I was out here working. I never saw his layout or what he had. I got the feeling he was not that good of a modeler, but he once told me that he had built retaining walls out of kitty litter. And I had never had a cat in my life at that point. And so I thought kitty litter was just rocks. Well, another time he came over and said his cat had died and he was going to bring me his leftover kitty litter, which he did. That's what this is. This is the very, very first kitty litter ever available. And it had all these different colors. So what I did is I would spread it out, take a single piece, dip it in white glue, and stick it on, and just slowly work my way up. So those are all individual pieces of kitty litter to replicate the retaining walls that the YV built up and down the canyon. So this is the settlement at Incline. There were a couple of buildings around the corner, but this is essentially all that was here. This is a little house that had a telephone, and they could talk to the person that was up at the top of the incline and tell them, okay, we're ready, so that they would start pulling an empty car up when it had been unhooked and so forth. These three guys, I met the guy on the left. His name is Jim Law. I met him in the early 70s. And Tom and Harry. There's a sign here. I had a good photo of that sign, and so I wanted to add it to my building. This is before computers, so I hand-lettered the sign so same spacing and everything. We had a person at work that would come in once in a while and did blueprinting for us. He had a process camera, so he took a picture of my artwork, reduced it to HO scale, and gave me a copy. I could read it under a 30-power microscope. Now, I told John about that story. He took his iPhone, click, yeah, I could read it. I told that story to a visitor a few weeks ago. She took her phone, took a picture, it was all blurry. It wasn't an iPhone. So there's a little shack right here. I modeled it. I didn't know what it was for until I asked Jim Law about it. What they would do is change the cable on the incline initially every 14 months. The cable was manufactured by the company that made the cables for the Brooklyn Bridge. Eventually there was a company in South San Francisco that made even a better cable, and that cable only was changed out every 18 months. But what they had to do was start out with extra slack so they had it long enough. And so when they started, the car that they wanted to hook up in might be way down here and it needed to be way up here. So there was a little winch there to pull the car up into place. These are from a kit that a manufacturer came out with several decades ago. And the kit itself was really good. And I bought 10 of them. I could use 5 here, 5 down at Merced Falls. But the bulkhead here was a single casting. And so there was, in the real ones, there were boards here and boards here vertical. And that single casting didn't do it for me. So what I did is I bought another 10 kits, threw away this bulkhead, made a 3D printed bulkhead that used real wood to fill in the areas here. I used his parts for this, and the underbody is from the kit. So these are kind of kit bashed, but they end up being a good, accurate model. Here's the incline. The actual incline was double tracked. So a loaded car came down on one track and an empty was pulled back up on the other track. I have this animated. There's a photocell here, one at the top, so I can have this car go up and down. Initially, I had one of the log cars on, and they would say, so why is it going back up with logs on it? Or so why is it coming down empty? So this is a better solution. This photo was taken looking around this curve, and all of these were there because the cable would come off, and they kept the cable from digging into this embankment here. Also in the photo, you can see this little set out for a hand car. I haven't mentioned the grass on the layout, which is yellow, because that's the color of grass in August in California. What happens in California, rains typically start in November and shut down by April. The grass is green, it's tall, no more rain, and it turns yellow. Here's a photo I took of my layout for a magazine article. One of my favorite photos, the best photo I've ever taken, and you can see in the photo the yellow grass here at Incline. I submitted that photo along with an article that was sent to a magazine in Switzerland. And someone there must have decided that I didn't have the lighting correct or something, because the grass should be green. And here's the photo that was in the magazine. Here's some other buildings that were around the corner from the bottom of the incline. This was a house owned by the lumber company. When they shut down in 1943, Jim Law bought it for $1. In order to have a transaction be totally legal, money has to be exchanged. And so a lot of times some say, oh, I'll sell that to you for $1, and then so forth. So he got it for $1. I met him around 1970. This was a road by then. I was in Yosemite with a friend of mine taking pictures in the fall, and we came down this road, and he saw a sign on this building that said Jim Law. And he says, hey, isn't that the guy that helped write a book and so forth? So we went and introduced ourselves, and that started a pattern of whenever we went to Yosemite, which we usually did about 3 times a year, we would stop and see Jim. And usually we would call and ask if he was home. Of course he's home. What else can he do? This is all that's there. The next town up is at least 15 miles away. So this was the station, very small station. Here was the house for the station agent. I didn't have a photo of it. I had a photo which showed kind of the top of it, and I was pretty sure that it was extending out over the cliff, close to the river. And after I got it built, I asked Jim Law about it, and he said, no. And I'm thinking, oh, no. Yeah, I think you're right. So I don't know if it's correct or not. This is El Portal. This is the start of the yards when the tracks came in and so forth. The track plan here is very close to the prototype. Here's the prototype drawing. And what I did was take out sections of straight track. So like right here, per the plan, this straight piece might have needed to be this long, but I saved room by making this long. And I took out some here. So these 2 switches are closer together than prototype. But that let me model all of the tracks that were here. And so when someone's building a train here, they're building the train the same way someone would have done in 1939. So this white building is still there. I was able to go measure it and actually get inside. It was the home and office for the owner of the Standard Oil distributor here in El Portal. He was probably the first person that worked from home. I can see him living in this section. This is the living room and so forth, and this is the offices. I can see him having breakfast and say, well, I'm going to work now, and he walks down the hall and he's at work. These buildings are still there, but really modified. They were very small buildings. People have put second-story additions on it. I've been inside this one. I knew the person that owned it and got inside, and he had some questions about changes and so forth, but it was neat to be able to do that. So I was able to measure all these up and build them all. El Portal Inn was the second hotel here in El Portal. I had 3 black and white photos of it. And one of the times I was down at Jim Law's, I was getting ready to build this, and I didn't want to mess up the paint color or paint scheme, but I really wanted a building that was not red or white or gray. So I asked Jim if he remembered this hotel. And I said, I really think this building was green with yellow trim. And he says, yeah, I think you're right. His daughter, who had lived with him her entire life, suddenly speaks up. The first time I'd ever heard her say something, and she said, no, Dad, I think you're wrong. I think it was red with white trim. So another building that's red or white or gray. This is the station at El Portal. This is an interesting model to build because it was designed by the civil engineer that worked for the Yosemite Valley Railroad and not an architect. He's also the one that designed the inclines. And what they did is they had all of these pieces of wood used as decorative elements. So there was a lot of work to build this building. It was a contest model, so I had this portion of the roof removable, and this was all detailed interior details. Ended up first place for structures. Got 124 points out of 125 points. My wife went and asked one of the judges why I lost 1 point. His answer, nothing's perfect. So that does it for this episode. What I'd hope to do is show you what a visitor to my layout sees and hears, the stories I tell him, the things I point out on the layout, so forth. With that, I hope to see you next time.